Once again this evening for tonight's episode of Trad Queen's Story Hour. I have a wonderful guest for you guys this evening. This is Christian Toto, who is a noted media critic and author. He also has his own podcast, the Hollywood in Toto podcast, which is such a wonderful last name for working with the Hollywood stuff, which is really awesome. Christian, how have you been doing? What have you been up to?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show. You know, the name is a blessing and a curse, and I'm trying to lean into it. But yeah, this is a busy. I mean, I feel like the news cycle when Trump was elected caught fire. In a sense, it never really went down. The flames are just still flickering every day, even with he's technically, out of the scene, although he's never out of the scene entirely. But yeah, and I think that, I cover Hollywood from a right of center perspective, but I feel like that's been swamped by free speech issues. It's been my passion of late, and it scares me to see free speech on decline. I'm shocked by it, and I'm shocked by Hollywood's reaction or lack of reaction to it too. That's been disappointing for me as a professional and as a movie person, because I have a weird career and I got into this because I love movies. That was my goal, and I thought, I don't care what people think in Hollywood. I don't care if they vote the same way I do, but gosh, if they can't stand up for free speech, that's where I've got a problem.
Yeah, I think that's a great stance to take, and that must be challenging for you. Now, I realize now that you're talking about it, I don't know, did you actually work in the movie scene, or have you always been more of a critic?
More of a critic. I was an art major in college and couldn't draw hands or feet. I thought maybe I should switch careers. So I became a writer, but I really wanted to review films. That was my goal. And I took a while. It's a boring story, but I got there. And, I've never been in the industry. I've kind of toyed with writing a screenplay back in the day, but never got serious about it. But, I have no problem talking to actors and sharing their creative journeys. And I love doing that. I think it's important. And I think pop culture does matter. But I think over the years, my initial love and I just want to talk about movies really evolved with the culture evolving. So now it's just not about, is the new Terminator movie good or bad? It's, what is the messaging in there? What are they trying to say? What are the actors trying to say? And so I think that, maybe it's good because it's more engaging, but there are trends that we're talking about that I think are also very toxic at the same time.
Yeah. So Andrew Breitbart is notable for having said, he's notable for many things, but he is specifically remembered by people closer to my age for having said politics is downstream of culture. And now, given what happened with Trump, and there's been like this ridiculous overlap between politics and culture. Do you think that distinction is still there? Do you think that's even worth mentioning at this point?
I mean, the distinction is blurry beyond compare. I worked with Andrew Breitbart briefly at Breitbart News, and I still remember the day when I saw his picture on the Drudge Report saying he had passed away. I was stunned then. I'm still stunned. But he got it. He got the culture. He got the media. He understood many things. He was way ahead of his time. I almost think the culture would be different if he were still alive today. But that's where we are. And I think that people on the right, on the center right, libertarians, I think they're finally understanding the power of that statement he said about the culture. And it does matter. It is important. And I like to quote or paraphrase Joe Biden, who talked about how shows like Modern Family and Will and Grace changed how we think about gay people on screen, off screen, marriage issues. I rarely say this, but I think Joe Biden was right. I think those shows did move the needle on the culture and did it in a very powerful way. So, I don't think you can separate the two at this point. They're intertwined.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Biden was right on that count. I think that anyone's capable of speaking the truth. How often they do it is entirely up to them.
It's a broken clock theory, I think.
Yeah, exactly. He's right approximately twice every 47 years or something like that. But yeah, so I think that's entirely correct. And I think, so I remember Jack Posobiec pitched this idea to me, and this has kind of been something that he leaned into, was that Glee was really the show that started wokeness. I was like, wow, that's interesting to pin it to one specific thing. But then when I was thinking about it, I don't know what you thought about Glee, if you had any exposure to it, but I was like, yeah, they're queuing it up, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I never got into the show. There's a lot of pulls on my time, but I don't I think there's a lot of wisdom to what he said. I look back at the Ghostbusters reboot from 2016 as another pivotal moment because it was, it was about empowerment. It's about, if women don't see these Ghostbusters as female, they'll never become scientists. It was this crazy conversation. And then if you didn't like the movie or didn't like the trailer, you were a misogynist, which like, well, it wasn't a good trailer. Okay. It just wasn't. And so I think that movie coming out, the conversation around it was another point, a tipping point, as it were. But I think Glee touched on some significant issues, and yeah, it registered. And I think I wouldn't disagree with that comment.
Yeah. I thought that was just really interesting, and it's not something I thought about before, so it really stuck in my mind because I was like, really, could that really be the case? But possibly so. But I think probably the better way to analyze that would be to say current events and culture are intertwined inextricably with politics now, and I don't see there's any way of getting out of that.
No.
I don't know are you capable of separating the art from the artist at this point?
Almost always, yes. I mean, I have to do it professionally,
right?
And there are I think for me, I think my best example is Michael Moore. I would struggle with a Michael Moore interview. I'll interview anyone. I don't care who they are, what their politics are. I mean, I'm an interviewer. It's what I do. And we should be able to kind of come together. And I don't want to be that divisive where I can't talk to someone because they disagree with me. My wife's a Bernie bro, so I kind of know on the home front how that works. But yeah, I mean, it can be challenging. It also depends what's been said. I imagine like an Angelina Jolie and I don't vote the same way. But I think she's often thoughtful, articulate. She actually goes to the places that she talks about and investigates. I don't think she just does the hot take and moves away. But there are other artists, when the rhetoric gets really heated, yeah, it's a little concerning. I grew up with John Cusack movies. I love him. I think he's a really interesting actor. I mean, I could, multiple films from him, his library are among my favorites of all time. And I follow him on Twitter, and he's the oddest duck around. He's very leftist, but who cares? But he's got this anger and this venom to him. His voice, his social media voice, is so unpleasant. And I have to think maybe he's somewhat unpleasant in person. I don't know. It's just that's an actor who comes to mind where I thought, gosh, he just seems thorny.
Yeah, I kind of felt the same with Ron Perlman because I was watching him during the Trump years, and I was like, I understand having political issues with whoever's in office. Trust me, I understand, especially since 2020, not approving of the person in office. But at the same time, it's never reached a point where I've said anything other than I've never disliked a president more than fill in the blank, right? Mm-hmm. It's never been this personal. It's never been like you said, it's kind of venomous, and it makes me wonder, you have more exposure to A-list celebrities than I have. Do you think that a lot of these people are super unhappy? Because that's kind of how it seems to me.
I do think there's something about fame and fortune that sounds wonderful and amazing. And it's what many, many people strive for. But once you get there, there's a hollowness to it. There's something that's missing. Some people fill it with drugs. Some people, reclaim their faith. And I think that's a far superior way to process what you're going through. But yeah, it is interesting. I think about Ron Perlman's a great example because I think he's a very good actor. He was wonderful in Sons of Anarchy. And he just seems unhinged. And I think the best example now is Rob Reiner, who was a terrific director. And he hasn't made a good movie 10, 15, 20 years. And I don't know whether your talent ebbs over time, but just to see him, what he says is it's just off the wall. It's why would you let politics get to you to that degree? It just seems kind of sad.
Yeah. So I was reading some of this data about how left-leaning people tend to end up sadder overall. And one of the things they pointed out was that when you are a progressive, the entire world turns into a battlefield, right? You're constantly fighting for this right and that right, and you're constantly pushing toward some undetermined endpoint. And it's like, yeah, I could see how that could be incredibly frustrating and kind of depressing because the world's not going to be going the way you want. Whereas with some, conservatives tend to focus much smaller. They don't look as much. They shouldn't. I'm constantly encouraging people to not look at the federal level, but to look at your neighbors and to look at your family and your kids and try to be like, all right, so how am I going to make a difference in my own family's lives? So what piece of advice would you give to people who are so overwhelmed by politics that it becomes their whole focus, like we see with Ron Perlman and Rob Reiner?
Mhm.
How can you get them to kind of refocus on what actually matters?
Get a dog. Start there.
That's great.
Nothing's more joyful than a dog. My dog is old and sick, and he may not have many more days left, but I'm enjoying him every second that he's around. I think you really have to do step back and think, okay, what matters in my life? What brings me joy? Do these changes within the political realm, do they directly impact me? And if they do, are there ways to circumvent that? But it is weird. I often poke fun at the woke crowd, and when they x-ray a movie or a TV show, I think, at the end of the day, it's just exhausting. Imagine being that person, going to a movie, you buy your popcorn, you settle in your seat and you think, it's not diverse enough. This is a story that lacks enough people of color on the screen. And whatever, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, maybe that's a non-factor. But just the fact that your mind is going there and thinking about that and trying to find ways to pick apart a project. At the end of the day, you go to a movie to escape, to really kind of, unwind, to be entertained, to be engaged, to be provoked. And it just seems very exhausting. It's the word that comes to mind so often, just to live in that life, to think about climate change 24/7 and to super analyze everything. I can't imagine their mental state. Everyone has enough stresses in my life. I worry about money, and just got a terrible news about our car. We'll have to get another car. I mean, life is hard enough. Life is tricky enough. There are enough challenges in life where you can't really, not that you're manufacturing them, because some of the worries are real, but perspective is everything.
Yeah, 100%. I agree. Now, when you say that about going to the movies, I think that's how it used to be. But increasingly, I feel like that's becoming less and less possible, even for the best faith people, right? People who are operating in good faith are like, okay, I'm just going to go to a movie. I'm just going to enjoy it. I'm not going to worry about all this stuff. Well, if they're ever online and they're reading about this movie, they're going to see nothing but relentless political diatribes about it. And I can't help feeling like, so my husband tends to think that Donald Trump was the start of a lot of this stuff, but I kind of disagree. I think that he was a symptom. I think he was not the cause. And when I look at the rest of current events and culture since he's been out of the public eye as much as he was, and I'm just mostly like, yeah, this has continued. I mean, I feel like he maybe kind of brought it to the forefront. Do you think he was a cause or an effect?
I mean, I think he's both. I think there's arguments on both sides. I watch late night pretty aggressively. I kind of track it in a sense. I'm not watching every show. It's impossible. But I remember when he rose up and he became the GOP standard bearer, I saw the different hosts basically say, okay, I'm all in on Hillary. It's all Trump jokes. There's nothing negative about Hillary. And so, the shows were left leaning beforehand for sure. I think Letterman was embracing his politics more in his later years. But that was a definite, like a switch was thrown. And that switch is still in that position. It hasn't changed. It's actually gotten more dramatic. So, you could say it's in response to Trump, but they didn't change once Trump left office. So, is the embrace of Trump partly because he fought the system? Sure, absolutely. It's a great appeal that he has. So I think it's complicated. I think I think both sides can be accounted for, but yeah, it hasn't, it's funny when he left office, I thought, well, maybe the mainstream media, which basically just became corrupt. I thought, okay, now Biden's in office. Maybe they go back to just reporting the news. Trump isn't there. They could subconsciously say, all right, back to the drawing board. We got to do our job. No, they've actually gotten worse.
Yeah,
almost on a daily basis. So, you can't blame stuff on Trump, man. It's on us. If you're a journalist and you can't sniff out stories because they're against your party, then that's on you. And to see that industry collapse in such a profound way has been shocking to me, even though I'm watching it in real time.
Yeah, I can't help feeling that Donald Trump really just kind of like ripped the veil away on a lot of stuff that was already going on. Like if you'll recall, Walter Duranty during I think it was the 30s, he went over to the USSR and he brought back glowing reports of everything great that was going on over there. And I think that should have been probably the first indicator to people who are paying attention. even though we didn't have the internet at the time, there still was, they tried to give him a Nobel, I think a Pulitzer Prize.
I think he did. I think he did win.
He did win
Yeah.
a Pulitzer Prize for that.
Yeah.
And he never retracted it, and nothing was ever done about that, even after we knew all the horrible things that were happening there.
In journalism's defense, I think those are more outliers than standard. I think it's all standard now. That's the most horrifying part. And by the way, there's a very good movie called Mr. Jones about that very situation, about the journalist who went over there and saw the reality and blew the whistle on Durante. So didn't get much attention. Came out a year or two ago, but you could probably stream it somewhere. But I recommend that.
I'm going to have to check that out, because the Durante thing was like, oh, they've just been doing this whole time. It's no change of pace at all for them. That's probably a little bit too cynical. I have to admit, especially because I worked with the Timcast company and did cool alternative media stuff with them. I have a lot of optimism as far as the alt media goes. I just really I gotta hold them accountable. Like, if I see people starting to lean one way, partisan or the other, I'm going to be like, we can't do that, because that's exactly what the mainstream media did. And we see where that ended up. That's not good for the country.
One of the things I try to do on my site and my work is not always fall for all the conservatives are writing about X, so I'm going to write about X, and I'm going to embrace their argument about this subject, because sometimes I disagree, or sometimes I'm a little skeptical of what's happening in the mainstream right. So it's hard, though. It's hard. We're living in very tribal times, and I think it probably would do my career a boost if I just went along with the pack. But I tried, and I'm sure I fail, but I try to be a little more skeptical, a little more cynical about what's happening on my side of the aisle. Because like you said, it is important. We can't just repeat the flaws of people on the left. That would be, that doesn't serve anyone well.
Yeah, and I see that tribalism even among the right. I mean, one of the things that I'm not grateful to Trump for doing was instilling this sense of, like the victimhood mentality, where I'm being particularly persecuted and targeted. Two things can be true at once. That can be happening, and also you can be pushing for higher goals that transcend you and your ego. That's what I really would like to see, because I hate to see the right kind of infighting and falling into the traps that the left has already tripped on their side. And I'm just like, no, we shouldn't be infighting. We shouldn't be falling for all this rhetoric that I hate to see. Yeah. It's harder to see coming from the right side, right? Because that's, if you are tribal at all and you lean in that direction, you're like, this is my side, right? We're better. Like, oh, no, we're all human.
Yeah, I see that a lot on conservative media. There are certain projects from a Hollywood style landscape that bubble up, and I feel like, when they do, they're so rare, and conservatives so rarely have the chance to get product out there that speaks to their values, that there should be almost universal support or promotion or something similar to that, and it doesn't always happen. If Michael Moore puts out a movie tomorrow, every mainstream entertainment magazine, website, whatever, they'll cover it, they'll interview him, they'll review the film, they'll do all the things that help in the promotional process. But if a specific right-leaning website puts out a product, there's a good chance that their competitors will just ignore it. And that just drives me crazy.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I talk about frequently. And that one's a tricky one. So I actually wanted to go through and put together like a curriculum of all the different ways that the media twists and angles to get their stories through and to stop other stories. And one of the most insidious ways they can do that is simply by not covering it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which means if you have a suspicion that this is happening, and you want to tell someone else about it, you can't just say, all right, you just got to look it up and you'll find it, because they won't. And in our current like online world, that's hard, right? How are you supposed to say, I know this is happening, look at this, point to certain article. I personally always like to pull left-leaning sources, and then I can be like, this really is happening. And you don't have to take it from me. MSNBC said it too, or whatever. It's always really helpful. That's why I'm in favor of like bipartisan news and being like, okay, well, you can prove that this is happening, and you can prove it with sources who don't agree with you on ideological grounds. I feel like that breaks the tribalism.
But, one catch there is that I've been trying that, and I think many people have been trying that with people like Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss and Glenn Greenwald. And now they have been almost thoroughly rejected
Mm.
by people on the left, maybe even some on the center, even though they are left of center, even though they've been, solidly left of center for quite some time. So you think they would be trustworthy, that when they say something, it would matter. But no, they've been effectively labeled right wing like Joe Rogan has, even though they're not.
Right.
Joe Rogan is not a right wing individual. He's going to vote for whoever the Democrats put up in 2024. I can almost guarantee it. But he is for free speech. He does want to have dialogue. And those are anathema to the modern left, which is terrifying, really.
It is terrifying. And I think that one of the things that the conservatives will always be better with is the recognition of someone as an individual, right? We appreciate people like, well, I've always appreciated Matt Taibbi because he's a good and thorough journalist, and he always has been, even when he was more left-leaning. But people like Joe Rogan can, and this is what I was saying with Joe Biden, right? Everybody has the potential to say something true. You don't have to agree with them on everything for them to say something true. And sometimes you don't like what they have to say that's true. And that could be just a reflection of your tribalism. But conservatives are better at recognizing that the individual is an individual and can hold positions that are maybe slightly off from what we believe. For whatever reason. Could be a lot of different reasons. We tend to be more compassionate about why people hold these views. But what do you think is going to happen with Matt Taibbi and people of his ilk, they would say, like Barry Weiss? Do you think they're going to have a comeback? Is there a moderate center they could appeal to?
I don't know. I really don't know. Some of the most damning evidence and stories and narratives we've seen over the last year have been so thoroughly ignored by the press. I think that Matt Taibbi is now considered the enemy to many people, and I don't think that changes. So, Barry Weiss created, I think, the Free Press as her new outlet. Good for her. I would trust what she says over most people. I don't know. It scares me. Once in a blue moon, I'll make the mistake of disparaging Dr. Fauci in front of my wife. Oh, no. And my wife is in a different media realm. So when I say something about him that's unpleasant, she doesn't understand it, because the news that she gets is uniformly, he's a savior, he's a hero, he did the best he could. Thank you, Dr. Fauci. So when I mention that I'm upset with him, she has no idea what I'm talking about. And so even just having a conversation, it's almost impossible. I'd have to bring out, spreadsheets and old stories and old quotes. And it's not really how life works. So I think there's two things that scare me the most about the culture right now is the attacks on free speech, which are absolutely devastating and getting worse. Yeah. And the fact that roughly half the country isn't hearing the whole story. And I think one of the perks of being conservative is I hear both, because I can't help but hear both. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. I see narratives happening in the mainstream press. So I'm aware of what's going on the left. And then I read, Daily Wire, and I read the Federalist and other sites. So I'm fairly up to speed on what's happening, the arguments pro and con. My wife isn't. Some of my dearest friends aren't. I lost my friendship with a guy I'd known for 20 years because we had a fight because he believed in the Russian collusion hoax. And he said that Governor Cuomo in New York was just a great governor and doing the best job possible. But I knew both weren't true. And we argued. And he just hung up on me one day. He said, I can't take this anymore. And I wouldn't have hung up on him. I didn't want to have the fight.
Right.
But, that's where we are. It's terrifying to me.
That's so hard. And for it to affect you so personally has to be especially challenging too.
And that's not isolated. I bet it's happening all over. I lost another friend. He was Trump just burrowed in his head so aggressively. It was sad. I mean,
that is hard.
The fight we had was silly, and so.
That's so frustrating. And I wanted to ask you, well, it is kind of personal, but I wanted to kind of talk about that because we see these cracks in our country, which are hard to watch. But I was reading a poll, I think back in October or November, about how 81% of people at least say to the pollster that they don't believe that politics are a good way to tell whether or not someone's a good person. Do you believe that number?
Yeah, polls like that they're odd. And I think that we behave with pollsters and we behave on social media differently than we do in real life. I mean, I could enter a room and meet someone who I know and I know well, and we could have a great conversation, and we could be very different people ideologically speaking. And then I'll go watch her on Facebook, and she'll be like this raging person.
Right.
So I think we have different selves. So I don't, those kind of polls I don't always trust. I don't think they're twisted or corrupted. I think what we say to a pollster is not always what we think in real life or how it react in real life.
Yeah, I think you're right on that count. Well, I remember the polling they were doing for Trump was heavily affected by the reality that people were not ever going to tell anyone that they were going to vote for him.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason it was such a shock to people when he won, because they were like, but the polls said that he wasn't going to win. I'm like, because there are some things that you're just not going to divulge to somebody who may judge you or who may think differently of you because of what you think. Now, I will say that is probably one of the biggest effects of the chilling of free speech is this kind of twisting, the self-censorship. I think, and you're welcome to disagree with me, but I think that self-censorship is a far bigger deal than any other kind of censorship. What do you think?
It's up there. It's for sure. I was talking to a filmmaker, I guess maybe last year, and he deals with a lot of issues with China. And he said often when they censor you in China, what they do is they don't share exactly why you were censored, why your material was erased or downgraded, whatever you want to call it. And he said they do that because they want to keep you guessing. Because if they said, well, you shouldn't say X, then you won't say X anymore. It's not great. But if they say you're out, and you go, oh gosh, what did I do? Was it this or this or this or that? So next time you think, I'm going to avoid all those things. So yeah, self-censorship is absolutely real. I think it happens with comedians. I think it happens with storytellers. They don't go near certain topics, and that's a shame. And so, you get lesser art for sure. But of course, it's much bigger than that. I focus on art because that's what I do. But it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. And to see comedians who have been there are comedians who are raging against cancel culture and who've been very strong and very vocal. Rob Schneider, John Cleese, Joe Rogan, Bill Maher. There are others like Mark Maron and Stephen Colbert. They've got pom-poms. They're cheering it on. It makes me sick to my stomach. Because even if you don't want to be aggressive or outrageous with your humor, you got to recognize the need for that, the importance of that, the fact that those things matter, and that you're getting to cultural truths, and you're experimenting and you're exploring and you're opening up dialogue, which can be very helpful and very healthy. And to shut that down is terrible.
Yeah, I'm constantly saying, fittingly because I'm wearing yellow, but I always say that comedians are the canary in the coal mine. They're one of the first places you should look for a kind of whiff of social dissent, and you should see what the ordinary person is thinking. And I think that Joe Rogan especially is the perfect emissary of that, because he is a very normal person. He's involved in super masculine sports. He's not overtly political, just interested in discussing ideas, and he's a comedian.
Yeah.
And he's been attacked relentlessly just for exercising his free speech, which should be a huge red flag to other comedians, right? You'd think it would be. I think what we're seeing, and somebody in a group chat of mine the other day mentioned the expression ladder pullers, and I think that's what a lot of these comedians are doing. They're pulling up the ladder after them. They've succeeded, right? Sarah Silverman, she was edgy. Jimmy Kimmel, he had the Man Show. I think it was Jimmy Kimmel. I constantly confuse the Jimmys. But they now are choosing to use their huge platforms to say, no more. You have to adhere to a very specific set of what borders on like a purity test or like a struggle session when it comes to saying the wrong things, like we saw with Dave Chappelle. Now, I will say one thing that gave me a little bit of hope when it came to the comedy world was Chris Rock. I don't know if you watched his recent special.
I did, yeah.
I wanted to talk about it. Did you find it interesting? Does it seem like people are kind of starting to wake up to this stuff?
Yeah, I didn't think he went as far as he could or should, but he certainly touched on some pretty interesting and important elements of comedy, of the culture, of victimhood status. So good for him. I think comedians are often not going where the funny is or where the conversations are. And Joe Rogan is a wonderful exception to that rule. But yeah, I thought the Rock special was quite good, quite interesting. And it's interesting because a lot of times when comedians debunk the woke, or they kind of take shots at sort of this far left worldview, the media critics will say, "Oh, it's so boring. It's so we've heard this a million." No, we haven't actually. It's pretty darn rare. But that their line of attack is very interesting. It reveals a lot about them. So, yeah, it's comedians should say what they want to say. They're comedians.
Yeah.
Listen, if Joe Biden goes out and says something outrageous and racist and crazy, he's the president. He's a politician. That matters. He's forging policy. We should judge him harshly. But if a comedian goes out there and says something that maybe was inappropriate or maybe went too far, well, he or she is a comedian. It's what they do.
Right.
And they have to kind of flirt with that line. They have to try new jokes. They have to kind of change their inflection, change the verbiage, because one joke which stinks today could be a killer bit tomorrow with just a little tinkering. So I talked to Jay Moore years ago. He said, the stand-up stage is my workshop. It's where I figure things out. And do we need to take that away? And why do we become so vulnerable that the wrong joke sends us into a tailspin? Just don't watch. There are certain comedians who are outrageous. Go watch Jim Gaffigan.
Yeah.
There are plenty of folks who are very funny and they're clean as a whistle. Just hang out with them. That's fine.
Exactly. Well, we always have that option. And that's something that I think people, ideologues intentionally choose to overlook because they're trying to pretend that there is some huge capture that these free thinking people have. And it's a huge problem, right?
Yeah.
They're wrong.
Well, may I circle back to the ladder puller? I think that's a good point, but I think it's more than that. I think it's fear. I think Jimmy Kimmel knows he dressed in blackface. I think he knows he was doing misogynistic bits. I don't care. They're funny. They're silly. They're outrageous. They're bawdy. But he knows that's his background. So when he steers to the left, part of it is it's protection. They're not going to take him down because he's valuable to the left. And I think the same, I grew up on Howard Stern. I worship the guy. I just thought he was so outrageous, so crazy, so funny, so adventurous, so off the wall, a true innovator. And he's woke now. And he knows that it just takes that to look at his old stuff. I mean, there is a treasure trove of wildly problematic material. You take any other day of programming, he's gone. So if he doesn't, promote the right causes, select the right politicians, he's in trouble. And when he got a little bit of that taste, he ran after Trump, and he knew that would protect him. And he's right. Yeah. He's absolutely right. And that's why, a quick point, woke is a joke because it's not consistent. If the people who are wokest, if they really wanted a better world, if they really wanted to be kinder, then they would be after the Howard Sterns. They would be after the people on their side too. They're not. It's a political wedge. It is not about being decent and kind and wonderful and making a better society. It's not. It's political. It's ideological. It's aggressive. It's a force.
Yes.
Don't anyone ever say otherwise, because that's the truth.
Yeah. Well, you're entirely correct, because it is inconsistent, because it is postmodern. It's subjective.
Yeah,
it's constantly changing. It has to. And this tracks, I'm going to say this, and I have to get back to something I just thought of that's very important. I lose my attention span so easily. It tracks kind of with what you're saying about China, because they keep you on the back foot. They keep you out of the loop. They don't tell you what you've done wrong. Now, you mentioned how people need to talk to suss out these ideas. I love this idea. This is a wonderful idea. I talk about this all the time with my husband because, we're in a marriage, so we're trying to figure out how can we communicate better. When I'm talking, he's like, "You're beating a dead horse. Why are you just discussing this again?" I say, "I am thinking through this. Like, this is how I figure out what I think about this. This is why women talk so much, right?" And you're right about, I think you mentioned Jay Moore being up on stage and talking about how this is where he thinks. And one of the things that I think that, one of the biggest things that censorship takes away is this human need to discuss our ideas and kind of figure out what we think. One of the things that you made me realize within the last few sentences when you were talking about Howard Stern was that I constantly talk about how, I already knew that Rage Against the Machine was going to do this. I already knew that Howard Stern was going to be the kind of person who did this. But now that you mentioned that to me, it makes sense, because, of course, you're correct. They are afraid, and they cannot be genuine, because if they were, people would just turn to their past and be like, "Oh, well, you did this, this, and this. You're out. You're done. You're canceled forever." And that makes perfect sense to me now that I think about it. Whereas when I was in high school, I was looking at some of these left-leaning pop punk bands, and I was like, how are these people, revenants? How are they anarchists? Because what they're calling for is literally, Bad Religion had a song called Kyoto Now about the Kyoto Protocol, and I was like, they're literally calling for more government involvement. How are they in any way contrarian? They're not. And, Greg Graffin is a professor at UC Berkeley, so he's certainly not someone fighting the machine, but it does make sense now that you mentioned the fear component. I do think that's it.
Yeah. And just to circle back to a thing we just talked about briefly, who targeted Joe Rogan? Neil Young, a rock and roll rebel from the 60s, a guy who was once on a freedom of speech tour during the Bush years. And, his criticisms have not aged well. Because, one of the things that Joe Rogan was famously saying back 2 or 3 years ago was maybe young, healthy people shouldn't take the vaccine. And now we're basically admitting, young, healthy people shouldn't take the vaccine. Yeah. Is that so crazy? Should that have been stripped from us? What a terrible cap on a wonderful career for Neil Young to go there and to be that guy, that voice. Just embarrassing. But I guess he doesn't feel it. He had the support of his artistic community, and the media had his back too. But wow, imagine that.
I know. Well, do you think that with some of these people, once you get to the upper echelons of fame and influence, there's a greater degree of peer pressure? Like there's so much more influence people can assert on them just by being
I mean, I think, Howard Stern, when I was growing up, he was a guy the media hated. They hated him. But then after a while, I think the media realized he was actually talented. He was smart. He was an innovator. And then he got older, he got a little wiser, he got more mellow. And now I think he wouldn't like it if the media turned on him savagely. He's enjoying that he's left of center and getting positive press and getting raves. And he's part of the in-group now. And I think for him at his late 60s to go back to being the rebel, I don't think he wants that. I don't think he wants to lose that adulation. I think he likes it. Yeah. So I think that the Howard Stern of yore is gone. And not just that he's older and more mature. I think his rebellious nature is just out the window. Yeah. He wants to be a part of the system. He wants to be loved. He wants to be approved. And it's sad when you don't retire when you should. He should have retired 20 years ago.
Agreed. Fully agreed. Well, on the topic of retiring, so you work a lot with these actors, and they have, a lot of them, these established gentlemen like James Woods. There are some people who are very vocally outspoken, like right-leaning conservative people, and they don't care because they have what's known among the youths as FU money. They have plenty of money. They have made their mark in the world. They have played their roles. They probably feel like they're pretty much done. They're okay if they're not cast in any huge movies moving forward. Have you met a lot of people who've said, I agree with you, but I can't say it?
Yeah, over the years, I've talked to people, usually on the lower rung of Hollywood, comedians, artists, even people behind the scenes. I know of an actor that everyone knows who keeps his views private for that reason. It's terrible. It's really terrible because at the end of the day, you can be Sean Penn and say whatever you want, but he's on the left. And, of course he should say whatever he wants. He's got free speech. Yeah. I would protect it all day long. And he's a great actor. So I have no problem with that. But there are very, very few actors who are on the right who are really as vocal. Nick Searcy throws a lot of sharp elbows on social media.
Yeah, he's great.
And he still works in Hollywood. I think he's maybe drifting more towards independent fare at this point. I don't know the whole story. And I think he still does mainstream stuff as well. He's a very good actor. But these are exceptions. They're not the rule. Jon Voight is a legend, and people will put up with him because he's a legend, because he's Jon Voight. And even Kelsey Grammer, who works a lot, he really isn't that vocal. He's gently right of center. He's a Christian, but he's not vicious. He's not vile. He's not, pounding his pulpit. So, it's hard to compare him to someone like a Patton Oswalt or a Colbert or something who's just nonstop politics. They're not the same. And again, Kelsey Grammer is really talented. So I think his message is modulated. It's kind of quiet, and he's allowed to keep working. But there are very few people who can do that.
So I think maybe it's easier for people who are right of center to keep it under their hat, because for them, politics is not the end all be all like it
Sure.
seems to be with people like Rob Schneider, or I think it's Rob Schneider you mentioned earlier. I might be getting the Robs confused. And then Ron Perlman, and people who get so up in arms. And it seems like the difference in political views might actually be what tempers people's willingness to be really, really, really outspoken and kind of unpleasant about them, which I suppose is a good thing. But I was thinking, we should make it much more feasible for everyone to share their opinions. Do you think that we should have... Well, that's an interesting conundrum, because while I do believe that everyone 100% should have free speech to say whatever they think, I also think that the influx of politics into culture has overall not been good for us. Should people be saying more or less overall as far as like Hollywood goes?
Well, I think they should say what they want. They should think about the impact on their career, in that if I'm an actor and I'm very vocal with my progressive politics, there's a chance I could alienate a Heartland viewer, and maybe he or she doesn't go to see my movie. And that's a more pragmatic, practical situation. If you're doing press for a new movie, you don't want to anger anyone. You just want to talk about how good the movie is. That should be your guiding light. But people should say what they want to say. And the fact that they can is terrifying. My dream, it is my recurring dream, and it's something I cling to aggressively, is that one day a George Clooney, a Tom Hanks, a Denzel Washington, a Julia Roberts, one of the older established superstars, will say, you know what? That Jon Voight, he and I, we don't agree on a darn thing. But I think he's one of the best actors around, and I would hate if he missed one gig because someone didn't like his politics. We should never be like that. And my conservative friends in Hollywood, my actors, my gaffers, all the people behind the scenes, they should never suffer a nanosecond for having a different point of view. I think that would really move the needle. And if other actors said, here, and just made a public stand and said, this is enough. This is enough. And I think that would take guts. I think a lot of actors probably don't even think about it and or realize it. And one of the things that I'm bummed about is that I used to work in DC, and I got a lot of celebrity interviews. I mean, Kevin Spacey before he was canceled, Tom Hanks, everybody. I talked to a lot of big stars. And I don't now. I'm based in Denver. There aren't that many junkets that come to Denver. And, COVID hurt that too. But I want to ask these stars about those questions. I want, not in a confrontational way, but just saying, what do you think about this? And I think many just don't know, or they're ignorant. I talked to Josh Brolin a couple of years ago about when it was just kind of bubbling up, the censorship happening on campuses across the country. And I asked him about it because he was a pretty cool guy. He was a straight shooter when I was talking to him. And I thought, I can ask him this. I think he'll give me a straight answer. He had no idea what I was talking about. No idea, no clue. So that news didn't get to him. And this was a few years ago, so maybe it wasn't widespread. And of course, the media covers it up. But I want to know. I don't know how you avoid that now. I want to ask an author of consequence, what do you think about Agatha Christie's work being changed, and Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming? Do you worry about your words being changed after you're gone? Do you think that's a good thing? Is that healthy? Is that something that's creatively prosperous, or is that something that's terrible? I want to hear what they have to say.
Well, I'm going to ask you this question that I have, and I'm going to ask you a question my husband just asked, because they're both pretty significant. I personally, it sounds like you would like to participate in my game show that I have designed for left-leaning ideologues. That's called Answer the Effing Question, where they get to sit down in a chair and just answer a question like yes or no. No postmodernism, no dancing around the issue, no tap dancing. Just answer the question, because it seems like they get away with not ever answering the question. And it sounds like you're sharing some of my frustration, where you would really just love to be able to ask some of these people just upfront, like, how would you feel about being censored like Roald Dahl has been? How would you feel about having your words changed? And how would you feel about having your characters tweaked after you put them into a movie or into a book, and then having them actually answer you? But the difference is that people who are on the left aren't held to such high standards of accountability. They should be.
And they don't get the tough questions either. If you're an actor and you're on the left and you have specific causes that you promote, you will not get a challenging question, Now, I wouldn't ask a challenging question of a generic actor who is promoting a product
Right.
because it's not really appropriate. But if I was interviewing an actor who's very political and maybe even the movie is politically charged, darn well right I'm going to ask those questions. That's important.
Yeah.
I remember I did get a chance to interview Jack Black a couple of years ago, and he had just done a video promoting, I think, the Iran deal.
Oh.
Obama's at Iran. And I asked him, I said, do you worry about alienating part of your audience when you do that? And he was very blunt and friendly. He said, yeah, I don't care.
Yeah.
But that's fine.
That's fine too.
That's an honest answer, and God bless him,
Yeah, yeah. Well, my husband wanted to know, is it possible that the vast majority of problems we're seeing in society today are as a result of a pandemic of cowardice? Ooh, that's a good question. A lack of bravery, you think?
Well, I wrote in my book, Virtue Bombs, that Hollywood has always been run by fear of getting older, fear of losing work, fear of your next movie not making as much as the previous movie. Fear, fear, fear. If you're a beautiful young actor or actress, there's always someone younger and prettier right behind you who's going to work for less. And then now you add the woke, and fear is off the charts. So absolutely cowardice plays a huge role, at least in Hollywood. It certainly does elsewhere too. But listen, if I really speak my mind on an issue or two, I could suffer consequences. And I am not rich. I'm a journalist. They don't make a lot of money.
Right.
But if I'm a Tom Hanks, or I've got millions of dollars in my mattress. And you would think that even if he lost a gig or two or suffered a little bit professionally, that they would have the courage to stand by their convictions. And I just don't think they want to go there. They'd rather play it safe. And I think that cowardice matters. And I think it hurts us.
I think so too. Well, especially at the cultural level, when the people that, young kids are basing their ideas of how the world works on, like people they're watching in movies. These are big stars. They make a lot of money. When they're not willing to stand up for what they themselves believe is true, then what kind of example is that setting? Won't someone think of the children honestly, though, because, they're not thinking about what the impact this is going to make for young people. I will say too, and then holy cow, I can't believe it's almost time to start wrapping up, but I'm always fascinated by the fact that the people who push the strongest left-leaning ideologies tend to be the people who are married, the people who do not get divorced, the people who have kids, the people who live this very conservative lifestyle. Why do you think that is? You think they recognize the truth there?
Well, it's almost like when you think about rom-coms. Rom-coms are a deeply conservative genre, and yet they're praised and adored by Hollywood. It's about boy meets girl, boy stays with girl, boy marries girl. It's about monogamy in most cases, not always, but it does happen a lot. So, but I also think that what we're looking at across Hollywood culture is performative. It's like, when George Floyd died, you better push that Black Lives Matter stuff out on your social media or else. And even if you do, like Mark Wahlberg did, he got in trouble because they uncovered his past where he was being an absolute jerk and a racist to people when he was a teenager. Oh, wow, so a lot of this is performance art. Because you need to do that to say, hey, I'm one of you. Come hire me. I'm a good person. I'm a progressive. I believe what you believe. Because that's going to give you a leg up. Why is John Leguizamo in this one-man crusade to make Hollywood uber-duber diverse? That dude works all the time. Yeah. But I bet you one of the reasons why he works all the time is he embraces all the correct causes. He's silly at times. He's a good actor. But that's a hire me sign. Oh, yeah. I don't think he cares as much as he thinks he cares, honestly. I could be wrong.
That's interesting, and I think you might be right. And I suspect there's a lot of that in Hollywood. One of the things I was observing, I think when we were talking to our friend Brett from Pop Culture Crisis, was that...
I love him, by the way. He's great. I did his show recently. He and Maria. They're so smart. They're so good.
It's great over there, right? I was going to mention that. I was going to say, I think you went on there, but I can't quite remember. That's awesome. I'm so glad you were a guest over there. That's a good show. I was over there a few times. A lot of fun. But one of the things I was saying was that it's a kind of person who is not deceitful, but they're literally constantly changing how others view them in order to fulfill a certain role or to get a certain role. So to some degree, it doesn't really surprise me that they are so quick and so moldable, right? they strike me as very impressionable. What did you think? Do you think that these people are impressionable since you've met some of them in person?
I think they have very thin skins, and I don't even mean that in a mean way. It just is. They're very sensitive. They want to be loved.
Right.
And yeah, that's part of it too. Is listen, they're actors. They can act. They can put out a certain brand, a certain persona, and if it helps them, then it's lucrative to them. Absolutely. I remember years ago I interviewed Liza Minnelli. We had a nice conversation, and she was like, "You must come backstage." I didn't do it, but she was like, "I'm just some young dumb journalist," and she's Liza Minnelli, man. She's a queen. Why does she care? But artists are like that. I've interviewed actors who, if you have a slight criticism of them, they kind of get a little antsy.
Yeah.
It's just they're artists. There's a type, and they're very talented, and they're very interesting, and they're very colorful. But yeah, that's part of it. But part of their protective shell is doing what they need to do to survive. Hollywood is a brutal industry, and you could have a great show today. You can be on top of the world, or tomorrow you're nothing.
Yeah.
It's like in music, the one-hit wonders. Imagine being that person, being at the top of the world, and then 10 years later, you're a session musician in anonymity. It's it's hard.
Yeah, I understand. Well, that's actually making me more empathetic to actors, surprisingly, because actors, I've always kind of been like, well, at the same time, I've always been like, they appear to have everything. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of fame. But we see them doing things like committing suicide and being addicted to drugs. And that really that itself makes me empathetic to them because they're clearly lacking something.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask you what you thought of Russell Brand and his recent discussions of Christianity, because I guess he converted to Christianity a few days ago, or he was talking about it a few days ago. What do you think about that?
He's a fascinating figure. The gift of gab, it's like a new definition under him. He's just the way he speaks, the flow, the intelligence, the wit. He was a hard leftist who was rather mean-spirited at times 8-9 years ago. And now he's more loving. He's more open. He's more positive. I think he's really wants to have dialogue. I think he's talented. And yeah, I mean, I think for someone like him who's got addiction demons, who's been through a lot, I think it's interesting to see his spiritual pursuit, and it matters to him deeply. I think he seems like a better person. He seems like a happier person, and I don't see the rage in him anymore. So I think it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. So one of the things that I feel like I'm constantly saying, because I've seen it so much in my own life, is that people who go through things like addiction and who successfully overcome it or come to terms with it or find a way to work around it are often the very strongest people I personally know. And that kind of tracks with a lot of my heroes having survived actual concentration camps. Like you have Solzhenitsyn, who survived the USSR concentration camps. I love Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camp. And then Corrie ten Boom, same idea. And these people, I've been developing this theory that one of the greatest things that humans can do is go through hardship. And that really shapes my outlook on the future too, because I suspect that we're going through a phase. So I'm going to say the thing I repeat every show. We have weak men right now making hard times, but then hard times are going to result in strong men who will then create more good times. And I say, you know what? We're going into hard times, but you know what? It's going to make ourselves and our kids much stronger. And I view that as a positive thing, because I think that the reason our culture is in the decline it's in is because things have been so easy for so long. And now we're terrified that things are not going to be as easy as they were. And I'm just like, I think that's what we need. I really do.
I remember before 9/11, I think we were as a nation obsessed with shark attacks, which I'm pretty sure affect a very, very small percentage of the population. Yeah. And then 9/11 happened and everything changed and we were just devastated and we had different worries, different fears. But before then, there was this gentleness, this peace, this quiet, where we could afford to get riled up over superficial things. I mean, I think part of the woke stuff is that too. So you're really, you can't sleep at night because that movie wasn't diverse enough, because there was a joke in there that made you upset. Really? I think life's pretty good when that's your cross to bear.
Yeah. And honestly, every time I see these videos from Libs of TikTok, I'm like, you know what solves this constant barrage of shifting pronouns and like this idea that you can identify as a literal bird would be
Mhm.
some actual hardship, like going to the store and then being like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we don't have any food. You're going to have to come back tomorrow. And then you got to figure out what am I doing? Right.
I think
Um,
like a lot of the protesters are often spoiled rich kids,
yes, yes,
you know.
yes. They've proven this. And one of the things they found with the protesters too was that a lot of them lived at home with their parents, like
Mhm.
literally basement dwellers. And
Yeah.
I understand, to be fair, I understand that there are kids today who live at home because it's impossible for millennials to even think about buying a house.
Mhm.
And it's really, really hard for, Zoomers to even consider starting a family. Whereas boomers are in like the prime years, they're doing fine. I saw an article the other day that said so many kids are still living at home that it's cutting into their parents' retirement. And I was like, oh no, maybe we should have voted for better policies. Like,
Yeah.
and there was a comic that it was a boomer saying, things were great when I was younger. You could buy a house for like $10,000 or whatever. And you only had to work one job. You'd have a car. Your wife could stay home. And then the kid is saying, that's great, Dad. What did you do to preserve that? And, there's no answer because that's kind of the point is that
Yeah.
often we don't look any further than the next week or two or month or
Mhm.
two.
That was a comedian saying that?
No, that was a comic, like a political comic.
Oh, okay, because it's
Yeah.
very insightful.
It is super insightful. And
Yeah.
I think about that stuff a lot because from the right, this is my little rant, I apologize. And then we'll look for the silver lining before we close.
Uh,
I look at a lot of what's happening to millennials and I see a lot of pushback from the right where they say, well, just be more responsible with money. In fact, I wrote a whole piece about this on Substack. There was a lady who went to the store and she came out and she recorded a TikTok video and she said, look, my partner, husband, boyfriend, whatever, and I together make almost $100,000 a year. We still have a hard time buying groceries. There's something wrong with that. And
yeah.
people were criticizing the fact that her nails were done. And I was like, I don't think you're looking at this the right way. You should be telling her that it's Joe Biden's fault that this is happening. Like this is your golden opportunity.
Yeah.
But because the right is focused so much on personal responsibility, they tend to want to blame people who are having a hard time. And when I post stuff like this, I constantly get people who are just like, yeah, live out in the rural area, don't live in a big city, don't engage in nightlife. I'm like, look, when I was 20, I lived in an apartment for which I paid $425 a month in Colorado Springs. I don't know if you've priced apartments in Colorado Springs recently. Probably not since you're in Denver, which is
A little higher.
yeah, it's a similar issue in Denver. I remember thinking like, I could never live in Denver. That's crazy. I went back and looked at apartments in Colorado Springs the other day. A studio was 3 times the cost of what a one bedroom was in 2012 or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was like, this doesn't work. Like this is no wonder everyone lives at home. It's not because they don't know how to manage money. It's probably because horrible policies have rocked our country and now they're in a really tight position that's actually really not their fault. So I have a lot of empathy and it's really hard to watch right wingers just be like, well, just, don't spend money on makeup or nails. I'm like, that's not the issue in question here.
Yeah.
But I feel like there has to be, to wrap it around, there has to be a silver lining here. So do you see signs of a coming silver lining, like some kind of breakthrough in the Hollywood side of things?
I see slimmers of hope. I've seen Warner Brothers Discovery team up with J.K. Rowling, even though they knew they'd get a lot of backlash.
I saw that.
Spotify stood by Joe Rogan. Netflix stood by Dave Chappelle. There are a lot of independent comedians who are working around the system and crushing it. We're seeing these outside the system films like Nefarious, The Chosen, Angel Studios is just being wildly successful, doing things on their terms, connecting directly with the audience. Kudos to everyone at Rumble who seem to be more aggressive and throwing money in the right direction. There are opportunities here, but it's a larger culture war fight. It does matter. It does involve Hollywood. And every time I get happy about a development, there's a couple more that just shut me down. So it's my optimism is measured.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's fine. I think that's fair. I think that's the only mature response to all this. You can't just be unbridledly optimistic. I sometimes
Yeah.
get accused of feeling like a Pollyanna, but I'm like, I really do feel like the sun's going to break through the clouds. I do. I think it's
Dennis Prager has been saying recently that despair is sinful. I hope I'm getting his verbiage right. And I get that, because to be despair means you do nothing.
right.
It means you wallow in your misery, you don't enjoy your life, and you give up. And we can't give up.
Yes, entirely. And my dad used to bang a similar drum. He was like, you can't be discouraged. And I was like, it's so natural to be discouraged. Everyone's discouraged sometimes. He's like, it's not what I mean. I mean, like, on an ongoing basis, it is counter to God's instructions to just stay down in the dumps. And I think he was probably saying this because he himself struggled with actual depression in his adult years. That was always kind of like a bother for him.
Yeah.
I think it was kind of maybe telling himself more than telling us that. But I love that Rumble's doing this stuff. I love that Daily Wire's up to this stuff. Public Square is another really cool organization because they're helping orchestrate the parallel economy, which is the name of the payment processing system that Dan Bongino put together. So I would really hold on to those things, because it's like the right has finally woken up to the fact that there is a market for this stuff.
Yeah.
With Budweiser being so silly with their marketing lately, I think that people are going to start to realize that I can't believe that this needs to be said, but there is a place for a beer that doesn't disparage people based on their beliefs. Now, I don't know about you. I thought the military was untouchable. I thought that beer was untouchable. I thought a lot of this stuff was, but I was wrong about the military. Apparently I was wrong about beer.
Nothing's untouchable today.
Right.
That's just the way it is. But and I in theory hate the parallel economy, but I don't have a plan B, so I'm all for it.
Yeah. What do you hate about it? That's a really interesting observation.
The fact that it's even necessary.
True. Yeah, that's fair. It shouldn't be.
Oh my
gosh,
gosh,
Yeah, I agree. But it feels like we have to, because if we don't, they're just going to keep telling us how much they hate us, and we're just going to keep giving them money.
Yeah.
Which, why would you do that? That's just really, really silly and ultimately self-defeating.
I prefer, boycotts, not boycotts.
Yes.
Like, go use your money in ways that are helpful.
Positive ways. Yeah. Well, the thing that I personally love about the Public Square app too is that aside from being a parallel economy, they also bring in a lot of local businesses. And then those local businesses kind of use it as a form of advertisement because it's free for them to join.
Yeah.
And then they get a lot of people who, a lot of them have big families, because this is the demographic that has the families. And then they go to all these, I love the idea of going to local businesses. We use Public Square here where we are on the East Coast, the very, very blue East Coast. We still have businesses that we can use that are in agreement with the principles of freedom that Public Square espouses. So that's really uplifting too. It's pretty much everywhere. The thing that I emphasized back in October 2021, kind of at the height of the pandemic, shortly before we all got COVID, which was horrible, was that there were two